Picture this, a sterile university lab, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the familiar scent of chemicals and ambition thick in the air. That was my world, my sanctuary. Every beaker in its place, every variable accounted for, every hypothesis. Tested and retested until certainty became my religion. I was 28, a biochemist with a reputation for precision that bordered on obsession. My colleagues called me brilliant. My mother called me lonely. Both were right. The day, everything. Change started like any other Tuesday. I was hunched over my microscope, studying cellular mitosis patterns, when Dr. Henderson, my department head, knocked on my lab door with that particular grimace that meant bad news. Budget cuts, he said, not meeting my eyes. University. Housing is being revoked for non-tenured faculty. Just like that. No warning, no gradual adjustment period. The variable that had remained constant for 3 years, my tiny but perfectly organized apartment on campus, was suddenly removed from the equation. You have 30 days, he added, already backing toward the door as if my shock might be contagious. 30 days to find housing in a city where rent prices defied all logic. 30 days to adapt to a change I hadn't planned for, hadn't prepared for, hadn't wanted. For the first time in years, I faced a problem that couldn't be solved with careful observation and methodical analysis. I needed a roommate. The very thought made my skin crawl. I'd spent my entire adult life creating order from chaos, maintaining systems that worked, eliminating variables that didn't. Now I was supposed to invite a complete stranger into my carefully curated existence. But necessity is a harsh teacher, and my bank account was even harsher. I approached roommate hunting like any good scientist would, with criteria. Specific, measurable, achievable criteria that would minimize disruption to my life. Must be quiet. Must be clean. Must respect personal space and boundaries. Must have regular income and excellent credit. Must not play music loudly, bring home random strangers, or cook with excessive amounts of garlic. For 2 weeks, I interviewed candidates who looked perfect on paper, but felt all wrong in person. The graduate student who seemed ideal until she mentioned her emotional support tarantula. The bank teller who checked every box except for the fact that she hummed constantly under her breath. I was starting to think I'd have to live in my car when I got the email. Hi, I'm Ava Torres, and I'm looking for a roommate. I'm an artist, which I know might sound scary, but I promise I'm responsible and clean, mostly. I saw your listing, and I love that you're a scientist. I think there's so much beauty in the intersection of art and science. Would you be open to meeting for coffee? Every rational part of my brain screamed no, an artist. Someone who probably lived paycheck to paycheck, if she got paychecks at all. Someone who used words like beauty and intersection in casual conversation. But something about that email nagged at me. Maybe it was the parenthetical mostly that suggested self-awareness. Maybe it was the way she'd framed science as beautiful instead of boring. Or maybe I was just desperate enough to consider any option that didn't involve explaining my life story to another stranger. I agreed to meet her. The cafe she chose was the antithesis of everything I usually gravitated toward. Mismatched furniture, local artwork covering every available wall space, the kind of place where the barista knew everyone's name and order. I arrived 10 minutes early, claiming a corner table where I could observe the entire room, a habit left over from too many years of being the only woman in male-dominated academic spaces. I was reviewing my prepared list of questions when she walked in, and I swear the entire room shifted. Not because she was conventionally beautiful, though she was wild curly hair that caught the afternoon light, paint-stained fingers that moved like they were perpetually creating something, but because she carried herself like someone who had never learned to doubt her right to take up space. She spotted me immediately, probably because I was the only person in the cafe wearing a lab coat. I'd come straight from work, and the sight of me must have been jarring. This rigid, clinical figure in a sea of bohemian chaos. Dr. Collins? Her voice was warm, slightly husky, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove you belong anywhere. Just Maria, I said, standing to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm, and there was a small smudge of blue paint on her thumb that, for some inexplicable reason, made my stomach flip. She slid into the seat across from me, and I noticed she was carrying a worn leather sketchbook. Its pages thick with use. While I pulled out my typed list of questions, she ordered something called a dirty chai with extra foam and proceeded to turn our interview into a conversation. So, what kind of science? She asked, stirring her drink. With genuine interest. Biochemistry. Cellular research, specifically. I waited for her eyes to glaze over for the polite nod and subject change that usually followed this revelation. Instead, she leaned forward. That's incredible. Like, you're literally studying the building blocks of life. The patterns that make us us. No one had ever described my work as incredible before. Impressive, maybe. Useful, certainly. But incredible? That suggested wonder, and wonder wasn't something I associated with my daily routine of pipettes and data analysis. I like patterns, she continued, flipping open her sketchbook. The way things connect, you know? The hidden structures underneath. She slid the book across the table, and I forgot how to breathe. The page showed a drawing, not realistic, but abstract, flowing of what I recognized as cellular mitosis. But where I saw a scientific process, she'd seen art. The chromosomes were rendered in sweeping brushstrokes, the cell membrane pulsing. With color, the entire division process transformed into something that looked like ... dancing. This is ... I stared at the drawing, my carefully prepared questions forgotten. This is mitosis. Is it accurate? She asked, and I could hear the genuine curiosity in her voice, tinged with something that might have been vulnerability. It's perfect, I said, and meant it. More than perfect, it was my work, my passion, reflected back to me through eyes that saw beauty where I saw only function. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes, and something in my chest loosened. Some knot I hadn't even realized was there. I like the shapes in your work, she said, echoing her email, the patterns. There's beauty in the numbers, you know. And just like that, against every logical instinct, every carefully constructed criterion, I found myself saying yes. Moving in with Ava was like introducing a drop of food coloring into clear water. Everything changed. Slowly at first, then all at once. She arrived on a Saturday morning with 3 friends, a van full of paintings, and enough plants to stock a greenhouse. I watched from my perfectly organized living room as chaos invaded my space, and felt something between panic and fascination as my minimalist aesthetic was slowly, cheerfully overwhelmed. Where should I put this? She asked, holding up a canvas. That was easily 6 feet tall and covered in swirling blues and greens that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I gestured vaguely at the blank wall space I'd maintained for 3 years, wherever you think it looks best. She studied the wall with the intensity I usually reserved for microscope slides, then hung the painting where it would catch. The morning light. The transformation was immediate, and startling. My sterile living room suddenly felt alive, like it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Over the following weeks, the integration continued. A paint-splattered coffee mug appeared next to my pristine lab notes. Sketches were tucked between my scientific journals. The apartment filled with the scent of turpentine and creativity. And I found myself oddly comforted by the organized chaos she brought. But it was the late-night conversations that really undid me. I'd always been a night owl, preferring to work when the world was quiet and distractions were minimal. I'd assumed Ava would be the type to crash early and sleep late, but I discovered she was as much a creature of the night as I was. Our first conversation happened by accident. I was in the kitchen at 2 a.m., making my third cup of coffee, when she emerged from her room in paint-stained pajamas, hair piled into a messy bun, looking like she'd been wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of art. Can't sleep either? She asked, moving to the sink to wash paint from her hands. I don't really sleep much, I admitted. My brain doesn't turn off easily. She nodded like she understood completely. The curse of the creative mind. Though I guess in your case, it's more like the curse of the analytical mind. That led to a conversation that stretched until sunrise, covering everything from the nature of creativity to the ethics of genetic modification to whether cereal counted as soup. We disagreed on almost everything, but in the most fascinating way, like two people looking at the same mountain from different sides, each seeing something true but incomplete. She challenged every assumption I'd ever made about art and intuition, and the value of things that couldn't be measured. I found myself defending positions I'd never questioned, and more surprisingly, sometimes changing my mind. You know what I think? She said one night about 3 weeks into our cohabitation. We were sitting on the couch, she with her sketchbook, me with my laptop and a stack of research papers. I think science and art are doing the same thing. We're both trying to understand the world, just using different languages. I paused, considering. That's actually not wrong. Did Dr. Maria Collins just admit she might be wrong about something? She grinned, and I felt that now familiar flutter in my chest. I said you weren't wrong. That's different. Yeah, haha. She was still grinning, and I found myself smiling back despite myself. That was the night I first noticed the way she looked. At me. Not like a roommate or a friend, but like something else. Something that made my pulse quicken and my carefully controlled world tilt slightly off its axis. The looks became more frequent, more obvious. She'd catch me reading in the morning, hair still messy from sleep, wearing an old t-shirt and pajama, pants, and something in her expression would shift, soften, intensify. I told myself I was imagining it, that my inexperience with roommates was making me misread friendly curiosity for something more. But the scientist in me couldn't ignore the data. The way she'd find excuses to touch me adjusting my lab coat collar, brushing paint from my cheek, reaching around me to grab something from the kitchen counter, her body warm against my back. For just a moment longer than necessary. The way she'd light up when I showed interest in her work, explaining her techniques with an enthusiasm that made her even more beautiful. The way she'd grown protective of my work schedule, making sure I ate, bringing me coffee without being asked, creating a buffer between me and the world so I could focus on my research. And the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, like I was something precious, something worth studying, something that mattered. I started conducting my own experiments. Nothing dramatic, just dot observations. I'd brush her hand when passing her coffee, noting the slight catch in her breath. I'd stand a little closer when she was showing me her latest painting, measuring the way her pupils dilated. I'd compliment her work and catalog the flush that crept up her neck. The results were consistent, measurable, undeniable. The attraction was mutual, but knowing that only made everything more complicated. Because I was Dr. Maria Collins, who had never mixed professional with personal, who had never let emotion override logic, who had never wanted anything as much as I was starting to want her. The breaking point came during a thunderstorm in early October. I was in my room, trying to work on a research paper that was due the next day when the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I found myself fumbling for my phone's flashlight. cursing the universe for its terrible timing. Maria? Ava's voice came from the living room, followed by the warm glow of candlelight. I found some candles. I emerged from my room to find her setting up what looked like a small shrine to productivity on our coffee table candles. My laptop, my research notes, even a cup of tea that was somehow still warm. I can't work by candlelight, I said, but my protest sounded weak even to my own ears. Why not? She settled onto the couch, patting the space beside her. Scientists worked by candlelight for centuries. Newton, Galileo, Darwin, they all did their best work with nothing but flames and curiosity. That's different. They didn't have electricity to depend on, and now you don't either. She smiled, and in the flickering light, she looked like something out of a painting herself. Come on, Dr. Collins, where's your sense of adventure? I sat beside her, close enough that I could smell her shampoo, something fruity and warm that made me think of summer afternoons. She'd pulled her hair back with a pencil, and there was a small smudge of charcoal on her cheek that I had to resist the urge to wipe away. See, she said, leaning over to point at my screen, the candlelight is perfect for reading. Very romantic. The word hung between us like a challenge, and I felt my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Romantic isn't really my area of expertise, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No? She turned to face me fully, and suddenly we were close enough that I could count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. What is your area of expertise, Dr. Collins? Biochemistry, cellular research, things that can be measured and tested and proven. And what about things that can't be measured? Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. What about the things that are true even when you can't prove them? I should have moved away. Should have made some excuse, grabbed my laptop, retreated to my room. But the candlelight was doing something to my brain, making it harder to think clearly. And she was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I don't know, I admitted. I've never really thought about it. Maybe it's time you did. And then she was kissing me. It wasn't dramatic or sweeping or any of the things I'd read about in books. It was soft and tentative and questioning, like she was asking permission even as she took it. Her lips were warm and slightly chapped, and she tasted like the peppermint tea she'd been drinking. For a moment, I froze. This wasn't in my plan. This wasn't something I could control or predict or analyze. This was pure chaos, pure feeling, pure want, and then I kissed her back. What followed was the most unscientific 3 weeks of my life. I couldn't focus on my research. I couldn't maintain my usual routines. I couldn't even think clearly when she was in the room, which was problematic. Since we lived in the same apartment, the kiss had changed everything and nothing. We hadn't talked about it, not directly, but there was a new awareness between us, a tension that made every casual interaction feel charged with possibility. She'd bring me coffee in the morning, and our fingers would brush as she handed me the mug. She'd ask about my work, and I'd find myself watching her mouth as she listened to my explanations. She'd laugh at something on TV, and I realized I'd been staring at her profile for the past 10 minutes. I was a mess. A distracted, unproductive, completely unprofessional mess. And I'd never been happier. The realization terrified me. I'd built my entire identity around control, around logic, around the ability to remain objective in any situation. But with Ava, objectivity was impossible. She was too close, too present, too important for me to maintain any semblance of scientific detachment. I started staying late at the lab, partly to catch up on the work I'd been neglecting, partly to avoid the inevitable conversation we needed to have. Because what if talking about it ruined everything? What if she decided the kiss had been a mistake? What if I had to go back to seeing her as just my roommate when I'd already started imagining her as so much more? But avoidance, I discovered, was not a sustainable long-term strategy. You've been avoiding me. I looked up from my laptop to find Ava standing in the doorway of my room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. It was late past midnight, and I'd been hiding in here for most of the evening, claiming work as an excuse. I'm not avoiding you, I said, which was a lie, and we both knew it. Right. That's why you've been leaving before I wake up and coming home after I go to bed. I closed my laptop, recognizing the futility of pretending to work when she was standing there looking at me like that. I've been busy. With what? Research? Papers, the usual. She stepped into my room uninvited, and I noticed she was still wearing the paint-stained apron she'd had on earlier. She'd been working on something new, something she'd been secretive about for the past week. Maria. She sat on the edge of my bed, close enough that I could smell her shampoo again. We need to talk. About what? About the fact that you kissed me back. My stomach dropped. I didn't. You did. Her voice was gentle but firm. And about the fact that you've been looking at me like you want to do it again. Heat flooded my cheeks. I don't know what you mean. And about the fact that I want you to. The words hung between us like a confession, and I felt my carefully constructed defenses crumble completely. This is complicated, I said finally. Why? Because we're roommates. Because I don't know how to do this. Because I've never. I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Never what? Never felt this way about anyone. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, but Ava's expression softened, and she reached out to touch my hand. But it's not a bad thing, she said. It's actually kind of beautiful. I don't know the rules, I continued, the words tumbling out now that I'd started. I don't know how to date someone I live with. I don't know how to separate my feelings from my logic. I don't know how to want something this much without understanding it. You don't have to understand it, she said. You just have to feel it. That's not how I work. I know. She smiled, and it was soft and fond and completely without judgment. But maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything needs to be understood to be true. I looked at her sitting there on my bed, paint-stained and patient and perfect, and felt something shift in my chest. Some equation I'd been trying to solve suddenly balanced itself. I want to try, I said. I don't know how, but I wanted to try. Good, she said, and leaned in to kiss me again. Dating your roommate, I discovered, was like conducting an experiment with no control group. Everything was variable, everything was unprecedented, everything was terrifying and exhilarating and completely uncharted. We started slowly, dinner dates in our own kitchen, movie nights on our own couch, conversations that stretched past dawn about everything and nothing and the spaces in between. She showed me her art with new eyes, explaining not just the technique, but the emotion behind each piece. I showed her my research with new words, finding ways to translate the beauty I saw in cellular structures into language she could understand. Look at this, I said one evening, pulling up a microscope image on my laptop. We were curled up on the couch, her head on my shoulder, and I could feel her breath against my neck as she leaned in to see the screen. What am I looking at? Mitosis? Cell division. But watch what happens when I adjust the contrast. I manipulated the image, and suddenly the chromosomes were glowing, the cell membrane pulsing with light. The entire process transformed into something that looked like art, she breathed. It looks like art. It is art, I said, and meant it. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. She turned to look at me, and in the glow of the laptop screen, her eyes were soft with something that might have been love. You're the most beautiful thing in the world, she said, and kissed me before I could overthink it. 3 months into our relationship, the first real challenge arrived in the form of a phone call. California Institute of Technology, Ava said, staring at her phone like it was a foreign object. They want to offer me a residency. I felt my coffee mug slip from my hands, heard it shatter against the kitchen floor, but couldn't seem to. Moved to clean it up. California, I repeated numbly. It's a year-long program. Full funding, studio space, the chance to work with some of the most innovative artists in the country. She was pacing now, running her hands through her hair. It's everything I've ever dreamed of. That's incredible, I managed, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. But it's in California. Yes, and you're here. Yes. She stopped pacing and looked at me, and I saw my own panic reflected in her eyes. I don't know what to do. Neither did I. For the first time in my life, I was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with research or logic or careful analysis. This was about love and sacrifice and the terrible mathematics of two people trying to build a life together when the world kept trying to pull them apart. When do you have to decide? I asked. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to figure out if love was enough to overcome logistics. 2 weeks to decide if I was willing to uproot my entire life for a relationship that was still so new, so uncertain, so completely outside my area of expertise. We'll figure it out, I said, though I had no idea how. Will we? We have to. I did what I always did when faced with an impossible problem. I researched long-distance relationships, success rates, variables that contributed to failure, strategies for maintaining intimacy across time zones, the psychology of separation and reunion. The data was not encouraging, but buried in all the statistics and case studies, I found something else. Stories of couples who'd made it work. People who'd chosen love over convenience, who'd figured out how to build a life together despite the obstacles. What if I came with you? I said one night, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Ava looked up from her sketchbook, surprise flickering across her face. To California, I could get a research position. There are labs there, universities, opportunities. Maria, her voice was soft, careful. You can't just uproot your entire life for me. Why not? Because what if it doesn't work? What if we get there and realize we're not as compatible as we thought? What if you hate California, or I hate the pressure of the residency, or we just fall apart? What if we don't? She set down her sketchbook and came to sit beside me on the couch. It's a huge risk. Everything worth doing is a risk. Since when do you believe that? I considered the question seriously. Since when did I believe that? Since when was I willing to make decisions based on hope rather than data, on feeling, rather than logic? Since I met you, I said. Since I realized that some equations can't be solved with numbers. The answer came to me at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, the way all my best insights did, quietly, unexpectedly, with the force of absolute certainty. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard Ava moving around in the kitchen. She'd been having trouble sleeping since the California offer, and I'd gotten used to the sound of her making late-night tea, the soft scratch of pencil on paper as she worked through her anxiety and sketches. I found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by drawings. But these weren't her usual abstract pieces. These were portraits of me, pages and pages of me, captured in moments I didn't even remember. Me reading, me laughing, me lost in thought, over my laptop. Me sleeping, me working, me simply existing in the space we'd created together. You've been drawing me, I said, and she looked up with guilty eyes. I couldn't sleep, she said, and you're what I think about when I can't sleep. I sat down across from her, studying the drawings. In them, I saw myself through her eyes, not as the rigid, controlled scientist I'd always believed myself to be, but as someone soft and thoughtful and worthy of artistic attention. These are beautiful, I said. They're for you. For us, for ... She gestured helplessly at the scattered papers. For whatever this is, What is this, Ava? I don't know, she said, but I know it's real. I know it's the most real thing I've ever felt. Then that's enough, I said. That's all we need to know. I submitted my application to 3 labs in California the next morning. By the time Ava woke up, I'd already started researching apartments, neighborhoods, coffee shops that might become our new regular spots. I'd mapped out the distance between her residency and the potential research facilities, calculated commute times, identified the variables that would need to be managed. What are you doing? She asked, looking over my shoulder at the screen full of tabs and spreadsheets. Planning, I said. Preparing. Making sure we have all the data we need to make this work. Maria. She sat down beside me, taking my hands. In hers. Are you sure about this? No, I said. I'm not sure about anything, but I'm sure about you. About us. About the fact that I'd rather take a risk with you than play it safe without you. She kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. Besides, I said when we broke apart, you've taught me something important. What's that? But the most important experiments are the ones where you don't know the outcome. Moving to California was like stepping into a different universe. Everything was brighter, warmer, more colorful than the life we'd left behind. Ava's residency program was housed in a converted warehouse in the arts district, and my new lab was a state-of-the-art facility that made my old workspace look like a high school chemistry set. We found an apartment with huge windows and exposed brick walls, the kind of space that looked like it was designed for an artist and a scientist to fall in love. Ava's canvases filled the walls, and my research papers covered every available surface. And somehow it all worked together in a way that felt like home. Look at this, Ava said one evening, showing me her latest piece. It was a collaboration with one of the other residents, a massive installation that combined her paintings with interactive elements that responded to movement and touch. It's incredible, I said, and meant it. The work was bold and innovative and completely outside anything I would have imagined possible. But look closer, she said, guiding me to a section of the canvas I'd missed. Do you see it? I studied the swirling patterns, the way the colors seemed to pulse and divide and merge, and suddenly I understood what I was looking at. Cellular mitosis, I breathed. Your work, she said, our work. The intersection of art and science. Just like we talked about. It's perfect, I said, and realized I was crying. We're perfect, she corrected, and kissed me in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by the physical manifestation of everything we'd built together. 6 months into our California adventure, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was working on a research project about cellular regeneration, trying to understand how certain organisms could repair damage that would be fatal to others. The data was frustrating, inconsistent, refusing to fit into any of the patterns I'd expected. Maybe you're asking the wrong question, Ava said one evening, finding me hunched over my laptop in a state of complete scientific frustration. What? Do you mean? You're trying to understand how they repair the damage, she said, settling beside me on the couch. But what if that's not the right question? What if the question is why they're not afraid to be damaged in the first place? I stared at her, then at my data, then back at her. That's actually brilliant. I have my moments. But she was right. When I shifted my focus from the repair mechanism to the organism's willingness to risk damage, everything clicked into place. The cells weren't just repairing themselves, they were adapting, evolving, using the damage as information to become stronger, more resilient, more capable of surviving in an uncertain world. You solved it, I said, grabbing her face and kissing her soundly. You solved my research problem. We solved it, she corrected, together. And that's when I realized that everything I'd been taught about love was wrong. It wasn't about finding someone who completed you or fixed you or made you whole. It was about finding someone who challenged you to become a better version of yourself. Someone who saw possibilities you'd never imagined. Someone who made you brave enough to risk everything for something beautiful. 1 year later, I published a paper that revolutionized our understanding of cellular resilience. The research had applications in everything from cancer treatment to aging research, and it earned me a tenure-track position at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Ava's residency ended with a solo show that was reviewed in major art publications and led to offers from galleries across the country. Her work was featured in museum exhibitions, and she was invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of art and science. We'd both succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, but the real victory was simpler than that. We'd learned to build a life together that honored both our individual passions and our shared commitment to each other. Do you ever regret it? I asked her one evening as we sat on our balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Regret what? Taking the risk, moving here, choosing this life instead of the safer one? She considered the question seriously, the way she always did when I asked her something important. Do you regret falling in love with me? She asked instead. Never. Then there's your answer. I reached for her hand, intertwining our fingers the way I'd learned to do over the past year, and felt the familiar sense of rightness that came with being exactly where I belonged. I have a hypothesis, I said. Oh yeah, what's that? That love isn't something you solve, it's something you live. And how do you plan to test that hypothesis, Dr. Collins? I turned to look at her, this woman who turned my carefully ordered world upside down and shown me what it meant to be truly alive, and smiled. With you, I said. For the rest of our lives. She kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I felt the last equation click into place. Not a solution, but a new beginning. Not an answer, but a better question. What does it mean to love someone completely? What does it mean to build a life with another person that honors both your individual dreams and your shared commitment to each other? What does it mean to choose love over fear, risk over safety, possibility over certainty? I still don't know the answers to those questions. But I know that with Ava beside me, I'm excited to spend the rest of my life finding out. That was 3 years ago. We're still here, still experimenting, still learning what it means to build a life together. Ava's latest show opens next month, and I've been selected to lead a new research initiative that could change the way we think about cellular regeneration. But the real discovery, the one that matters most, is this: love isn't a problem to be solved. It's not a hypothesis to be tested or a variable to be controlled. It's a choice you make every day, a commitment to seeing the world through someone else's eyes, a willingness to let yourself be changed by the experience of truly knowing another person. And if you're very lucky, if you're brave enough to take the risk, you might find that the most beautiful reactions happen when you stop trying to control the outcome and just let yourself feel what's possible. That's the equation I've been working on my whole life, and I finally understand it's not meant to be solved, it's meant to be lived. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I still go back to that moment in the cafe when she showed me her drawing of mitosis. The way she saw art in my science, beauty in my data, possibility in my rigid world. I think about how close I came to saying no, how easily I could have missed the most important discovery of my life, but I didn't. I said yes to coffee with a stranger. I said yes to living with someone who saw the world differently than I did. I said yes to letting myself be changed by love, even when I didn't understand what that meant. And now, when my students ask me about the nature of scientific discovery, I tell them this: the most important breakthroughs don't come from having all the answers. They come from being brave enough to ask new questions, to sit with uncertainty, to let yourself be surprised by what you find. Love taught me that. Ava taught me that. This beautiful, chaotic, uncontrollable life we've built together taught me that. The equation of us isn't something that can be solved. It's something that unfolds day by day, choice by choice, risk by risk, into something more beautiful than I ever imagined possible. And that, I think, is the most important data of all.